Ωραία. Αρχίζουμε. Ωραία. Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Συνεχίζουμε το πρόγραμμά μας με την εισήγηση της Dr. AWASTHI. Επιτρέψτε μου να κάνω μία εισαγωγή στα ελληνικά που και η ίδια επιθυμεί και στα αγγλικά για να τιμήσουμε όλους παρευρίσκονται μέσα στην αίθουσα. Η Dr. AWASTHI είναι αναλύτρια συμπεριφοράς, ήταν η πρώτη αναλύτρια συμπεριφοράς από την Αγγλία στην Ιαπωνία για μεγάλο διάστημα. Πρόσφατα έχει λάβει το διδακτορικό της από το Πανεπιστήμιο του Belfast στην ανάλυση συμπεριφοράς. Έχει ιδρύσει μία ιδιωτική εταιρεία και δουλεύει με παιδιά με ειδικές ανάγκες. Είναι η ίδια διευθύντρια στην εταιρεία, εκπαιδεύει γονείς και εκπαιδευτές. Έχει λάβει στη χώρα της και όχι μόνο 3 βραβεία από το 2004 μέχρι το 2013. Εύχομαι να λάβω και ακόμα περισσότερα. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. AWASTHI. She has completed her ABA education from University of North Texas. She was the first behavior analyst from the UK to Japan. She started her career working in villages on a UNICEF project in rehabilitation special needs children. She founded ABA India in 2009, and a year later she founded Behavior Momentum India, where she's clinical director. She recently completed her PhD at Queen University Belfast. She has presented research papers and posters at conferences organized by ABBA International. In 2005, she has been awarded Special Awardee for Autism Awareness in India. In 2009, awarded the International Development Grant by ABBA International, and in 2013 has been awarded the Rotary. Her presentation title is The Emergence of Vocalization in Non-Vocal Children with Autism, Building an Evidence Base for Intervention. Please.
Kalispera. Let me first begin by thanking Robert Mellon for inviting me. It's a great pleasure being here. I've been watching all the students. You are also highly motivated. And if this was India, most of the people would have gone by now. But you're still here, you're asking questions, and it is really amazing. What a wonderful student audience. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so let me begin by giving a little introduction about what I have done and how I reached here and why this topic, became relevant for me. I started my career in the field of special needs in 1984. And I was introduced to behavior analysis in 2000 when I attended some workshops in Dubai by some of the eminent behavior analysts who visited Dubai and made some presentations there. Suddenly, when I did behavior analysis, it opened the doors for me. I could see so much more that I could do. And when we're talking about behavior modification, then how, change behaviors with scientific knowledge. So it really was a wonderful opportunity for me. However, the situation in India was pretty bad. And I started visiting India and I started training people. I started doing workshops over there. It took me 6 years to realize that you can't do behavior analysis without supervision. So you have to be present there as a board-certified behavior analyst, supervising students, and that's the time. It took me 6 years, a lot of hard work, and then I realized that what I did was useless. It was really a waste of my time. And so I went back and packed my bags, and I started my first center. So let me show you. Now, India is a huge country with a lot of people over there. 1.25 billion people in the country, and I started my first center in Lucknow, which is the top arrow. Once I did that, once I opened that center, very soon a lot of inquiries started coming, a lot of people started talking, and I opened my next center in Bangalore. Oh, there are a lot of arrows coming already. Okay. Is it going on auto? I don't know. I think so. Can we stop that? Because then I don't know how to control. So I went around, opened so many centers, started recruiting people. We recruited psychologists, we recruited special educators, we recruited people from any background, we recruited students who were grade 12, and we realized in India, psychologists don't want to work hard. So we had to do with whoever came to work with us, and we trained them, and we supervised them, and we set up a system so that they were continuously being supervised. And once I formed all these organizations, these are a couple of my teams that you can see. This is from Bangalore, this is from near Delhi, this is another team from Bangalore, this is from Mumbai. So we had a lot of people. I have a team right now of about 175 paraprofessionals. Some of them are psychologists. I have a team of people who are... So we started training and supervising, and I'll show you a small video clip of how the centers work. It's a completely one-to-one center, so there's a one student and one trainer ratio. In case we have difficulties with trainers because they're getting married and they're going away and all of that, then we make small groups, but there's always one-to-one therapy going on within the center. So here it is. So you can see
let's join the dots.
there are a lot of people sitting in the same room.
Let's join. Join the dots. Let's go. Yeah, that's good. Excellent job. Come, let's jump again. One, two, three. And yes. Very good.
So there's a lot of play interspersed. So there's a lot of work which happens sitting at the table, and then they're moving in the natural environment, then they play, and then they come back and work at the table. So there's a lot of activity going on over there. So that's how the centers work, and all this, setting up so many centers, gave me an opportunity to come across thousands of children in India, because there would be so many kids coming in every day, being referred and coming. And that's where I came across so many children without speech. So if you look at autism, and autism being a neurological disorder, speech and language and communication are the most important parts of the disorder that are affected. And neurotypical children, they develop speech naturally. They start babbling, they get positively reinforced by people around them. They just learn one thing to the next. And you don't have to go teaching them specifically various things. However, children with autism, they require highly specialized training. You need to look at various research methodologies that people are using to train them to develop their speech and language and communication. So, did it move to the next slide? Yes, it did. Okay. So, if we look at the percentage, Lord and McGee found that in children with autism, there are 21 to 66% children with autism who do not develop communication or speech without intervention. That's a huge number. And approximately 25 to 62% to 61% of children with autism are present with no functional speech, which means that they have speech, but they will either echo after you. So if you say, "What is your name?" and they'll say, "What's your name?" And they don't have functional speech. They cannot ask what they want. They cannot comment on things that they see around them. And so functional speech is missing in a lot of children. And 30% children with autism remain non-verbal by the age of 9. And non-verbal, of course, is a term which talks about being unable to communicate, but it can also sometimes mean non-vocal. And so it's not very clear by this definition whether they're talking about non-vocal or non-verbal. But being unable to communicate and possibly also being without speech. Now, speech and communication is a behavioral cusp, which means that if we can learn to speak, then we can access all the reinforcers around us. We can access whatever we want. We can remove aversives that we don't want. So speech is a behavioral cusp. If we have speech, then we can interact in new environments. We can respond to questions from a teacher in a class, and we can communicate in all possible ways. So working on speech is an area which should go beyond the speech and language pathologist. So far, traditionally, whenever there was a child who doesn't have speech, the person is referred to the speech and language pathologist. But now, with so many children with autism being diagnosed without speech, it becomes the responsibility of the rest of the community, including parents and behavior analysts and anybody else who's doing behavior modification, to work on speech so that life becomes easier for children with autism, and they can access those reinforcers just by talking rather than getting into behaviors. And many times we all know that behaviors occur and children go into behaviors because they don't have speech. They're not able to communicate. So speech is an area where we all need to start working on because of prevalence within autism. So if you look at the behavioral literature, then within the behavioral literature, there has been a lot of work which has happened. And I'll present a little bit about each one of them. Initially, in 1970s, Lowas and his colleagues, they used echoic training and shaping to develop speech. Echoic training would mean that we ask somebody to speak after us, and the child speaks. Imitates your vocal model and says whatever you're asking the child to say. However, it's not as easy as it looks with children with autism. And many times they will not echo, or they're not able to echo. And during this study, there were also some aversives which were used, where there was some punishment procedure which was used with the children. And it was, a method which has not been replicated much. And there are some studies which have found that if you use echoic training, it puts a lot of stress on the child, and the child doesn't want to sit with you and doesn't want to respond with you because they are not able to access reinforcers, because if you ask the child to say, they can't say. So this hasn't been a very popular method of teaching speech or developing speech in people. Shaping is another procedure that has been used in the behavior analytic literature, where you develop from a point where there is some speech. So if a child has some speech, then shaping would be a procedure that can be used for developing speech and communication. However, if the child is completely non-vocal and is mute and is not able to say even one word, what do you do? So shaping is not a successful procedure to develop speech. Another method that has been used with success was rapid motor imitation and man training. And during this, Ross and Greer in 2003 actually worked with 5 children, where they worked on gross motor imitation, followed by fine motor imitation, and interspersed vocal models within the imitation. So you can say it was a method of using behavior momentum to get vocals, and this procedure helped all the 5 children who were participants who were part of the study to evoke vocal. However, the problem in this particular study was that the children who were the participants selected, they didn't have any imitation. So the team, they really struggled hard for a year to teach them imitation, fine motor, gross motor and fine motor imitation, and then they could implement the independent variable. Suri and Greer did another study in the same year where they selected 2 students, and both the participants had imitation. So they were able to move and implement the independent variable of using interspersing vocal models within the imitation, and both the participants actually ended up with vocals. So this was a good method, but for some reason there isn't much research in developing vocalization using this method also. Then another strategy that has been used has been using stimulus-stimulus pairing. Now, in 1996, Sundberg did his first study using stimulus-stimulus pairing, in which he took 5 participants, and what they did was they paired a weak stimulus with a reinforcer. And they conditioned the weak stimulus so that it had pairing effect, and that led to improvement in vocals. And all 5 participants in the study emerged with vocals once they used stimulus-stimulus pairing. However, the participants already had some form of vocal or the other. So what they did, for example, was they selected a sound that the student could make, like, for example, E, and they paired it with tickles. So what they did was that they did about 15 pairings of the word E with the tickles, and they didn't ask the child to say anything. It's the therapist who said the word E and paired it with tickles, and 15 pairings like that, and they did many pairings which led to the emergence of vocalizations, and all the 5 participants, their vocalizations improved. So they started saying more words, they started using more speech during the process of their intervention. However, the effect of the pairing was temporary. So the moment they stopped, it's moving. So the moment they stopped the intervention, the vocals dropped. Okay. However, stimulus-stimulus pairing had good results, and so a lot of other authors went on to use this methodology and tried to see the effect of it. Miguel et al., they modified some of the things that were done in the initial study by Sundberg. some other, a lot of other actually studies are there where they modified some of the variables and they tried to do stimulus-stimulus pairing with reinforcement, without reinforcement, and they found that some studies showed good results, some studies showed improvement in vocalizations, and some did not show. So overall, there was mixed result using stimulus-stimulus pairing. However, there is the literature has a lot of studies, research studies, which have used stimulus-stimulus pairing. Then, after that, the literature also has alternative augmentative communication systems. And you must have heard about manual sign training for teaching communication. Picture exchange system, you've all heard about picture exchange system as a way of communication, and also using speech generating devices for children who don't have vocals. So these are methods where the whole focus has been teaching communication rather than actually evoking speech. However, some of the studies have demonstrated that there are vocals which have emerged as a byproduct of the whole communication training that was done. So these are some of the basic literature which are behavior analytic in nature. If we look at the timeline, you can see that there is very little literature and work going on between the 1970s and 1996, almost 2000. But between 2000 and 2017, there have been a lot of studies which are focusing on developing evoking vocals and communication training within the... It's moving. It's moving faster than me. Okay. So there are a lot of studies which have come up, and some corroborate the stand that children without speech can be the speech can be evoked in some of the children, and some have demonstrated that there cannot be any increase in speech or vocalization. So there are mixed studies over there. One of the common factors that I found when I was doing my research here was that there was a lot of variation in the definition of vocalization. So there were studies in which there were some participants who had vocals, and their vocals increased as a result of implementing the independent variable, whereas there were some participants who were non-vocal. So it was not very clear what exactly is the definition of non-vocal in literature. All of the studies say non-vocal, and they already have some children who have vocal in the study. But the participants are having a range of vocalizations. Some have 200 mans and tacts and a lot of vocals over there, but they cannot be called non-vocal, and they are still called non-vocal, and they are part of the literature and research. So that was one very important thing. Sorry, I think it's jumping again. Yeah. So there's a variation in the definition of vocal in literature. That's one thing. And the second is many studies had children with pre-existing vocals. So this was very confusing, because here you're trying to teach a non-vocal child how to develop vocals, but the literature is not giving very clear picture on what exactly you need to do. So in my current research, I address these two situations by selecting non-vocal and almost mute participants with no vocals at all. And the second thing was limiting the sample to children with autism spectrum disorder, because the characteristics of children who have a diagnosis of autism are very different from children who have global developmental delays and other disabilities. So we try to focus on only the autism children. So this was one important part of the research. So we are talking about completely non-vocal children. The second thing that I came up with in my research was finding methods that could be used for developing speech in non-vocal children with autism. So the first research question here was that if we implement sign-man training with stimulus-stimulus pairing, would it evoke vocals in children with autism? That's the first thing. The second was, if the above fails, then would introducing time delay in the presentation of the paired stimulus will induce vocals? So that was the second variable. The third thing that we had in the research was that if both these procedures fail, and if you're doing stimulus-stimulus pairing with a child without vocals and it doesn't evoke vocals, then would an addition of intraverbal training lead to vocalizations? And fourthly, if we do sign-man training and stimulus-stimulus pairing and we do intraverbal training together as a treatment package, would it result in evocation of vocals? So these were the four research questions that tried to address. Now these are the four experiments that we had, and look at the number of participants over there. So the first experiment we had just sign-man training and stimulus-stimulus pairing, and I had 59 participants across 13 multiple baseline studies. In the second experiment we had sign-man training with time delay, and here we had only 3 participants and there was only 1 multiple baseline study. The third experiment had sign-man training with stimulus-stimulus pairing, and then there was a delay, and there was later on the second independent variable, which is the intraverbal training, was added to the experiment. And there were a total of 46 participants, and there were 10 MBLs in this study. And the experiment 4 had both the variables as a treatment package presented together, and we had 19 total participants and 5 MBLs in this study. I'm going to today discuss with you only the first one, because it's impossible to discuss all of them, and I'll be showing you some videos from the work. Okay. Yes. So the first experiment, the first MBL from the first experiment, the first MBL is what I'm going to discuss here. There were 5 male participants between the ages of 2.8 years and 13.5 years who participated in this study. All had a diagnosis of autism. 3 of the children were between the ages of 2.8 years and 3 years. They were very young and they had no history of intervention. One participant, Digun, he had 8 months of speech therapy, and he was 3.4 years. And the fifth participant, Daco, was 10. He was 13.5 years, and he had almost 10 years of speech therapy and occupational therapy in the past. All of them had a behavioral language assessment score of less than 25 across different domains, across 12 domains, which was MANS, TACs, intraverbals, receptive language, listener responding, echoics, FFCs, and all the other play, vocalization, imitation, etc. Very, very low scores, basically. They were at level 2, and they didn't have much of a repertoire of language, imitation, or speech. So that was the participant. Now, the settings and materials that we used for the intervention was, sessions were all conducted in a one-to-one setting, 5 days a week across Monday to Friday, and most of the children were on IBI intervention. So other than the manned training and the independent variable that we were going to use, the rest of the listener responding tasks and imitation and visual performance tasks were going on simultaneously in the IBI. So they would be, brought out for the intervention, and they would be, continuing with their IBI programs. So the intervention was held across the classroom, the play area, and the computer area. In the classroom, they were at the table where they had all their reinforcers in a rack. And as you saw in the video, there were 3 to 5 children in the room, so it was pretty noisy and all of that. And so that was the classroom where the intervention would go on. Then they had the play area where there were swings and slides and all kinds of play equipment. And so they would be moving to the play area for intervention. And then there was the computer area, which was a separate area where they had preloaded songs and rhymes and their favorite things on the computer. And so they would be moving between these reinforcers. The dependent variable in the study was the emergence of 7 topographically distinct vocals emitted as a phoneme, as a word approximation or word across any operant, which could be a mand, an echoic mand, a tact, or an intraverbal, and excluded crying, grunting, babbling, giggling, and all of that. So 7 words, distinct words, had to emerge for us to say that, yes, this child is now vocal. Just a very quick, okay. And to select the target words, we initially did a preference assessment because all the targets, they were all, teaching was done under manned condition. So the preference assessment was done across 8 sessions, across 4 days to ensure that we really had the correct reinforcers selected. In the park, it was the preference assessment was done as a free operant method, where the children were allowed to just go and search and play with anything that they wanted, and their engagement with a particular preferred item was looked at. How much duration they were spending with the particular item was noted down, and the play equipments were ranked based on how much engagement was with each. At the tabletop, multiple stimulus without replacement was used as a method of preference assessment, where a variety of toys, bubbles, and various things were presented at the table, and they could choose from there, and they were ranked by the frequency with which they were selected. If there was no, or if there were not many reinforcers or preferred items for a particular child, then there were a lot of contrived situations that were created. For example, blocking the door, so there could be an opportunity for them to say, open the door, or open the jar, or they were made to sit on a swing if they were really young, and they could be taught to say, push me. So a variety of contrived mands were selected for the target. So here is an example of some of the students and their preferences. So about 10 to 15 items were selected for each student, and they were ranked so that we could select the target mans from those items. Now, the responses were measured across various situations like the pre-baseline, the baseline, intervention, and acquisition probes. Now, pre-baseline probes, pre-baseline measurement was done basically to measure if there was any vocal present within the child, and if the child was already vocal in some way or the other. So, a behavioral language assessment was conducted to ensure that the child was vocal or non-vocal. Along with that, early echoic skills assessment by Barbara S., which is part of the VB map, was also conducted to ensure that the vocal status of the child could be identified. Based on this, the selection of the student was made, because if the child was vocal and emerged with any vocal during these assessments, then they were not selected. So the baseline was conducted just before the assessment. As the student became available, because all the students were not available at the same time, so we had students come in, and then just before they went on the intervention, a baseline assessment was done. And during this time, we actually had a form which measured their vocalization across different verbal operands like the mans, tacts, echoics, and intraverbals. And once the intervention started, then a daily first trial probe was conducted on the target mans only. And if there was vocal emergence during intervention, then an acquisition probe was conducted, which means after the vocal emergence and a consistent vocal emergence as per mastery criteria, acquisition probes were conducted across all the assessments that we did during baseline, which is the mans, tacts, intraverbals, and echoics. So we wanted to be sure that if the vocal is emerging during the intervention, then is it generalizing across operands? So if the child is able to man, then would the child also echo if we assess on an echoic? Just to quickly go through all the verbal operands. So the man was a request for something desired. So here our definition as per the verbal operand Skinner's taxonomy was that it should be a vocal communication. So a vocal emittance of request for something desired, or the ability to repeat exactly what is heard, that would be an echoic. Tact would be a vocal label of an item, action, person, activity when in contact through the senses. And intraverbal was a vocal response made to what has been said by another person about something which is not present. So this is the form that we used. I don't know whether you can see it, but so the form has different parts. The first assessment was on mans. So from the preference list that we made, we selected about 6 items, and we contrived a situation for the child to be motivated enough to use speech. And if the child was accessing a reinforcer or a preferred item, then the delivery of the reinforcer was delayed by about 5 to 7 seconds so that the child could come up with speech. And if the child did not vocalize, then the item was anyhow given to the child because it was a manned situation, and we didn't want to have the child be agitated or get upset. So the item was delivered anyhow to the child. From the reinforcer list, we selected 2 items on which we measured for tacts. So the item was shown to the child 5 times, 5 presentations were made for each item, and they were asked, what is this? And if the child could label it, then it was noted down as yes and no data. So tacting or labeling was also measured. Then echoics, for echoics, we selected 5 very basic syllables like a, o, ba, and some 5 basic sounds were randomly selected without any plan or any review of the literature. They were the simplest sounds we could think of, and these 5 sounds were presented, and a small delay was provided after the presentation. If they echoed, data was taken, and they were removed from the study. So echoics were measured like this. And finally, for the intraverbals, we had 3 situations. One was rhymes. So rhymes were sung where the last word was omitted. So the trainer sung the rhyme, twinkle, twinkle, little, and waited. And if the child said star, then data was taken and the child was excluded from the study. If the child did not say anything, then there was a 5 to 7 second delay, and then the child was distracted to something else. The second intraverbal that we looked at was fun fill-ins. For example, ready, steady, go, 1, 2, 3. These are fun fill-ins where you're in context and there's a lot of fun going on. And then you have these statements where the child has the opportunity to fill the last word. And the third thing that we assessed in intraverbal was animal sounds, like you say cow says and the child can say moo. So we had a lot of intraverbal assessments because children have opportunities to learn these from the natural environment, and we really wanted to exclude any of such vocals emerging from the child at a later stage. So once the assessments were done, baseline assessment ensured that we had non-vocal children who were going on the intervention. An IOA was conducted, and we had 95% inter-observer agreement as far as baseline goes, and all the children were declared non-vocal. And staff training was assessed through treatment integrity checks, and we found that if the staff was making an error in the delivery of the intervention and their scores were less than 80%, then they were trained again, and we wanted to make sure that the protocols, the independent variable is being implemented exactly the way it is planned. So treatment integrity checks were done. The experimental design that we used was non-concurrent, delayed MBL, because what happened was we had so many centers across the country, and some child or the other would be getting admission, coming non-vocal, and we wanted this child to come on the intervention. So as soon as the first child on the first participant on the MBL would emerge with the first vocal, we could take the second child coming in on that particular MBL. So there were times when there were simultaneously a couple of MBLs running across the country. And so each participant was added to the MBL as they became available once the previous participant acquired a minimum of one vocal, or it could be more vocals. So baseline study for all these participants demonstrated that they had no vocals across man stacks, echoics, or intraverbals. And the intervention was conducted in view, with items in view, out of reach. Each trial had 3 pairings, and 40-man trials were conducted for each. There were 6, sorry, I should have written there. There were 6 targets which were selected for man training, and each target was worked on, and situations were contrived because the child was constantly moving from one environment to the other. So there were a lot of opportunities for having the child motivated, and 40 trials were conducted every day. Now, this is how the independent variable was implemented. The learner demonstrated motivation and reached out for a particular item, could be a play equipment, could be the computer, or could be any toys. The trainer prompted the sign and paired the target vocal, gave a 2-second pause, prompted the sign again, and paired the target vocal again, delivered the item, preferred item to the child, and then with a 2-second pause, paired the target word once again. So this was the independent variable, and I'm going to show you one video over here of how this was implemented.
Toy. Toy. Toy.
So this is one where the child reaches out and the pairing is done. I'll show you another video where a mother is working with the child, and this is in a home setting.
A book. And here goes quack. Duck says quack quack. Birdie. Turn page. Turn page.
So here the child already signed. The child has learned over a period of time to sign. So the child signed, and so she did not have to prompt the sign, and she just went through the protocol, which is saying it with 2-second delays. So, oh.
Papu powder. Papu powder. What's papu powder? photo. Turn page. Turn page. Here comes your hat. Hat.
So that was the independent variable where the pairing was done 3 times. A couple of times you saw that she did it only twice, but then that's how it was supposed to be done. This is just a video of. It's not, this child was not part of the intervention, but this video was made long time back and I have consent to show this video, so I'm showing it. Now, this is after the intervention, so look at what happens after.
Nod your heads. Nod your Very good. Very good. Nod your head. Wow, it is there. 4, 7, 8. You see 8? Oh, 9 is there. 10. Oh, 11 is that we cannot see. Huh?
So you can see that speech has emerged, and let me now share the data from the current experiment. So this is a 5-step MBL where there are 5 participants. In the first participant, you see that he acquired 6 sign lands prior to vocals. So that was the first thing that happened. And his first vocal emerged within the 2nd week. And that was a phoneme. I can't see from here, but that was a phoneme, I think, move for music, bar for ball. So the phoneme started emerging when we did the protocols. And the 7th vocal emerged by the 5th week. He acquired all the vocals as independent mans, which means that he was not echoing after the trainer, and he would sign and he would say, and that's how his vocals emerged as independent mans. The second participant, he did not acquire any signs prior to vocals, and his first vocal emerged in the 3rd week, and the 7th vocal emerged in the 5th week, and he was able to speak words clearly and ask for things that he wanted. So he just emerged with independent vocals in manned situations. The third participant, as you can see, did not acquire any vocals. His intervention continued for a year, and a couple of months went in working with him because he was very non-compliant. He was the youngest of this group. He was 2 years, 8 months, and he did not learn anything, for a long time. So he remained non-vocal. The 4th participant started emerging with vocals after a couple of weeks, actually, I think about 9 weeks, and he spoke syllables and became vocal and met the mastery criteria of 7 vocals, and similarly with the 5th participant. So the results show that Sign-Man protocol was effective in evoking vocals in 4 of the 5 children with autism. 4 acquired 3 to 7 manual signs prior to vocal emergence. The 5th child was non-vocal. He also acquired vocals. I'll talk about it later. 2 of the children acquired all 7 vocals in 3 to 28 weeks, and all vocals emerged as mans. For 2 of the other participants, they took much longer, between 22 to 28 weeks, to acquire all 7 vocals. And they emerged as echoic mans, which means that they were echoing after the vocal presentation. They were not independently manding. The vocals acquired had permanent effects. So they were not temporary like the previous studies on stimulus-stimulus pairing. They were permanent. Vocals emerged as phonemes, words, or word approximations for the children. Vocals emerged across operants, however, never as tacts. So they occurred with these children as mans and echoic mans, but for some other participants, they also emerged as intraverbals and echoics. The participant who remained non-vocal was 2.8 years old and was on intervention for 1 year and remained non-vocal. And during this period, he acquired only 8 imitations, only 2 body parts, and after 8 weeks of his being on the intervention, it was decided that we are going to use an orienting cue to get him to look, and maybe he was missing out something, maybe there was a blocking effect, so we put that on the intervention, and even that took 216 days to acquire, and by the time he acquired that, he was about to leave, and so he left. So he did remain non-vocal on the study. Now, let me share with you some of the replication effects on experiment 1. So in all, there were, this study was replicated on 51 participants across 12 MBLs, and 83% of these participants were male and 27% were females. 17% were females. All participants had a BLA score of less than 24, which means, again, they were level 2, they didn't have too many skills, and everybody had a 0 score on the ESA. Out of these replication MBLs, 42 acquired vocals and 9 remained non-vocal. So a summary of experiment 1 suggests that out of 58 participants who were on the manned protocol with stimulus-stimulus pairing, between the ages of 1.4 years to 13.5 years, 48 acquired vocals and 10 remained non-vocal. Now, if we look at the number of days that they took to acquire vocals, we find that 7% participants took an average of 4 days to acquire each vocal. 31% took about 12 days to acquire each vocal. So 7 vocals to meet mastery criteria, and I can't see. 22% took 24 days for each vocal. 24% took 50 days for each vocal, and 27% remained non-vocal. So this is how we looked at the number of days they have taken to acquire vocals. And because we were looking at consistency, we were ensuring that they were, once vocals emerged, they were consistent and they were not dropping off, and there was IOA, inter-observer agreement. It has possibly been one of the reasons why some of the participants really took a long time to move on. If we look at the vocal emergence in much more detail, we find that almost 18 participants of the 58 acquired all 7 vocals within 3 months, 1 to 90 days. However, if you look at the first graph, 36 participants emerged with their first vocal within the first 3 months, which means that vocals emerged but stability was not there. And that's what we were looking at, and gives the detail about how the first vocal emerged and how the 7th vocal emerged among all the participants. Another thing that we looked at in this was the vocal emergence across verbal operants. So while we were just working on manned training and we were working on stimulus-stimulus pairing during manned conditions, we also looked at vocal emergence as echoics and intraverbals. So 56% of the vocals emerged were as mans. 30% were echoic mans, which means they were echoing once the pairing was being done. 7% participants, they started echoing, which means that for some participants, motivating operation was not the reason for the echoic, and the vocals emerged under stimulus control when somebody else used a word. So they emerged under echoic conditions, and interestingly, 7% actually emerged with vocals as intraverbals, because when we were doing the acquisition probes, we found that we never taught them, nobody ever taught them to say twinkle, twinkle little and say star, but they did emerge with the star without teaching, which means they started learning from the environment somewhere and they acquired those vocals. So this was very interesting. None of the participants emerged with tags, so they were not labeling when they were asked what is this for their preferred items, including their preferred items. So items which they were manding for, when they were presented that and we asked them what is this, they never labeled it. So there were no tags over there. Speech clarity was a very important issue that we discovered in the study. 41% participants had emerged with words. So their first word was clear, they were using the right word, they were saying ball and they were not saying ball. They were saying music and they were not saying move for music. So they emerged with words, whereas 59% of the participants emerged with phonemes. So they used word approximations, and their signs could not be dropped because of that reason, because they were not very clear. So they had to continue with their sign training while their vocal emerged. So what we find from this experiment was that stimulus-stimulus pairing led to the emergence of vocals in 83% participants who were non-vocal and had no speech at all between the ages of 1.4 and 13.5 years. So the oldest child to acquire vocals by this method was 13.5, and this boy had already been on speech therapy and occupational therapy for years. So, and within a year he was vocal using stimulus-stimulus pairing. All children were non-vocal and mute, and it appears that age may not be a criteria for vocalization. Now, the youngest child who remained non-vocal and where we did not see any emergence of vocals was 2 years, 1 month. And he was on the intervention for almost a year, but did not emerge with vocals. So we don't know what are the factors over there that led to non-emergence of vocals. And the oldest child who remained non-vocal on this study was 9 years, 6 months. So we had both of them. The oldest child to emerge with vocals was the 13.5-year-old boy. The third factor was factors leading to difference in rate of acquisition was not identified. We could not find out why some children were acquiring quickly, why some did not. And sometimes when the intervention was going on for almost a year, there could have been maturation effects which could have led to vocal emergence. We don't know. We also could have faced confounds from family intervention. Maybe mothers were working at home, maybe family was working actively at home, and we were not aware about those things. So that could have possibly been one of the factors that led to the vocal emergence. Another area that we possibly need to look at in the future when we are studying is the effect of comorbidities on learning rates, the effect of anxiety. The 58 participants who were part of this particular study, there were at least 3 of them who went on medication. And and we were not very sure whether anxiety was one of the causes why they did not acquire speech and language. 2 of the participants who went on anxiety medication took 4 years to emerge with vocals. So they were on the same intervention, which was going on for years, and they emerged with vocals after 4 years, not as mans or as echoics, but as intravocals. And they started filling in rhymes, they started singing rhymes, and those, were where the vocal emergence happened. So this is another area that needs to be studied in much more detail to understand what could be the blocking factor, what could be the reason why participants, some children will not speak. Then there are a lot of studies where various factors like number of pairings have been studied. And there is a lot of debate within the literature between whether you need to pair the word once or you need to pair it 15 times. How many times do you pair the words together? So our study had only 3 pairings per trial, but there are studies where 1 pairing has also been effective. And then there are studies where 15 pairings have also shown positive results. So this is something that needs to be explored much more. Just a continuation, because it was very hard for me to do 2 studies which I really wanted to show over here. The second study where we added the intraverbal variable, we found that there was only 1 pairing over there. So when we were presenting the intraverbal variable, we did only 1 pairing. Like, for example, we said twinkle, twinkle, little star, and that's it, and we reinforced. Or we said ready, steady, go, and we just did 1 pairing, and we provided the preferred item. And with that 1 pairing, we got some excellent results. So this is something that really needs to be studied across participants to see whether pairings, number of pairings can also evoke vocalizations much more quickly. So there are a lot of areas that research can be extended in the future on this. And of the total number of 124 participants, 126 participants who were part of these 4 experiments that we did, we had results of 83% participants coming up emerging with vocals. Participants who were part of the treatment package, where we had the sign-man training with stimulus pairing along with the intraverbal training going on simultaneously, we found the best results over there, and we saw that 17 out of 19 children, they emerged with vocals during that study. So possibly that could be one of the things that needs to be extended further and need to studied more. So between the first, the second, the third, and the 4th experiment, we found that stimulus pairing has shown excellent results with all our children who participated on the study, and this needs to be studied further with vocal to work on emergence of vocals. So I think I want to stop here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.